Imperium sine fine dedi. Rome probably wasn't founded by the kinslaying son of a god. Bronze Age Italy was always on the periphery of the great empires of the East. Iron Age Italy was much like the rest of Western Europe, a land of clans and small tribes, loosely controlled by chiefs whose authority only went as far as their personal reputation. That's why they made such garish displays of grave goods, to show off to their followers. And then, as prehistory became history, society grew. Humans can be very altruistic animals to those within their in-group, be it their direct family, their tribe, or something larger. New community identities built on common myths and sacrifice subsumed tribal affiliations in a process called sonoikism. Networks of tribal leaders became organised hierarchies able to mobilise the resources of their community to build earthworks, or drain lands, or staff armies. And in the dispersed and agrarian land of Italy, cities emerged to act as popular centres. These communities had become states. A community which can raise walls and armies has such an advantage over those which can't, and so all the peoples of Italy, the Greek settlers of the southern city-state polises, the Etruscans with their non-Indo-European tongue, all the Italic people from the Oscan Samnites and Companions to the Umbrian Marsi and Sabines, the possibly Illyrian Apulians, and the Celtic Gauls from across the Alps. They all engaged in state building to different degrees of urbanisation and ethnic homogeneity. And the Latins, speakers of an Italic language separate from the Oscan-Umbrian group, were no different. They inhabited the wide fields and farmlands to the south of Etruria, and built several cities, one of which they called Roma. If one was to visit Rome in its earliest days, you would not see a city fated to govern the world. You would not see a city founded by a demigod literally called the Little Roman. You would see just one of the many constantly trading and warring states which dotted the peninsula, just one region in the wider Mediterranean world. The Roman people were not stronger, or more pious, or more blessed by the gods than anyone else. So why was it them, not the Tarentines, or the Samnites, or the Gauls, or the Greeks, or the Punics, or the Iberians, or the Illyrians, but the citizens of Rome, who built an empire without limit? Why is it that Latin is the only Italic language to survive to today? I believe the answer lies in the relationships and treaties the Romans built with these other, often forgotten states in Italy. Alliances with their friends, the Socii. Roman writings tell us how they were initially ruled by a line of 7 kings. The first was supposedly Romulus, their founder, and the rest are hardly less mythical. They also say that under the last 3 kings, Etruscan warlords, Rome forced all of the polises of Latium into subjection. And that's very possible. At this time, Rome was already one of the largest cities in Italy, but any form of Roman rule would have been indirect, and not out of the goodness of their hearts. Large communities are sustained by a complex hierarchy. Societies where all citizens don't know each other intimately need codified laws to resolve disputes between them, and thus they need magistrates to know and interpret this law. They need officials to collect taxes and oversee festivals and lead armies. These officials were members of the local elite. Unpaid, they served out of a sense of obligation, monera, to their community, something they wouldn't feel towards a foreign conqueror. There was no apolitical bureaucracy. If the Romans wanted to rule a conquered people, they would have to install a garrison and replace their entire government. This was something the early Roman state, emergent from loose tribal structures, ruling a tiny strip of land along the Tiber, couldn't do. Even when the Romans had built a world-spanning empire, they never really developed an administrative state, outsourcing provincial taxation to private tax farmers, despite all the comically obvious problems that caused. And so, the point of war and conquest could not be to rule your neighbours, but was instead to enrich yourselves at their expense. Roman overlordship would have come in the form of a tribute to empire, closer to a mafia shakedown ring than any traditional imperium. After victory over the Latins, they will have made them declare submission and pay up to not be destroyed. Other city-states like Athens or Tenochtitlan, under the same conditions, did the exact same thing, using military superiority to extort their neighbours for gold and feathers. The issue was, subject states were humiliated, they felt conquered, but they weren't really conquered. Their governments had to be left intact to have something to demand the tribute from, and a system which can raise taxes is one which can raise an army. It was fear of the hegemon alone, the fear of defeat and reprisal, which kept the tribute flowing. And so, as soon as a single crack appeared in the hegemon's mask of superiority, their so-called empire would crumble to dust. In their desperate attempts to keep rebellious polises in line, the Athenians planted clericies of their own loyal citizens, tore down walls to make cities easier to reconquer, and utilised extremely harsh terror tactics to ensure that no one would ever challenge them. Everything short of garrisons everywhere, which they simply couldn't afford. So, the only feeling these efforts inspired was hatred, and Athens' empire fell. The same thing happened when the last king of Rome was overthrown by the city's senatorial elite for trying to rule without them. The other Latins took this as an opportunity to reclaim their lost liberty. The new Roman Republic managed to reassert itself, and at the ensuing war's end, the Latins were made to sign the Foedus Casinaeum. Yet no tribute was demanded from the Latins, nor any formal submission. Instead, the Romans had just created the model for how they would take Italy. When the Romans defeated another people, their states were made to sign a treaty, Foedus, promising to always have the same friends and enemies as the Republic. In effect, they were joined together into a kind of military confederation, bound to supply half of the manpower of Rome's armies, fighting on the wings or ally, in any war Rome fought. And that's all. No taxes or tribute or Roman law. States made to sign these treaties were called Socii, comrades in arms. The Romans were unable to directly supervise allied states. They could choose to rise up at any time. But what set the Roman system apart was that it offered positive incentives for the governments of allied states to choose to remain within the system. 3 primary benefits. The first was common defence. Italian states faced near constant military threats from their immediate neighbours and incursions from Gallic raiders. This system allowed all of these states to pool their resources, under Roman leadership, to fight off enemies which threatened them all. Much like what disparate tribesmen once did when building states. The second was financial. As I touched upon earlier, the primary aim of early Italian warfare was to make a profit, both in victory by extracting tribute, but also during the war by raiding and, most lucratively, by sacking a city. The foedera guaranteed a fair division of the loot, and so fighting alongside the successful Romans could be very lucrative indeed. And the third was to do with the internal politics of classical policies. One must always remember that states are ultimately made up of people. Ruling elites faced very strong social pressure to serve their state above all, but that wasn't the only pressure they were under. Classical states were violently striven by factional politics between elitist and populist movements, and the great dynasties which led them. Relinquishing sovereignty by allying with the Roman outsiders was often of less concern than being assassinated by your rivals without their support. For the Socii, their citizens were winning battles alongside the legions, and bringing hordes of gold and slaves back home. This kind of tribute made it difficult to see themselves as oppressed subjects. The point was not that revolts were eliminated. The pursuit of liberty was reason enough to rise, even for Rome's Latin brothers. But rebellions were made infrequent enough that the cost of holding new territories was made less than the benefits. When states did try to break their treaties though, it was force which ultimately upheld this system. To reinforce their control, the Romans often confiscated strategic parcels of land from defeated communities to build new, loyal settlements upon. Some of these colonies, planted along the coast, were little more than self-sustaining garrisons. The most famous of these was Ostia. But others were large enough to be states in their own right, requiring their own government. Colonists would have to exchange their Roman citizenship for citizenship in this new community, called a Latin colony after the Latin rights that were granted. And then, other entire regions, like rich Campania, were made wholesale into Roman territory. To be a free man on the Ager Romanus was to be a Roman citizen, and so, to ensure that the conquered wouldn't then control the conquerors, the inhabitants of these regions were given civitas sine suffragio, all the obligations of citizenship, without the right to vote. Latium was also annexed after its last insurrection, but the Romans considered their Latin brothers worthy of full citizenship. The states of Latium were given the new status of municipia, effectively real local government. Their citizens would decide on local affairs in their own city, but then could travel to Rome to participate in the wider national political process. Ultimately, these distinctions only really determined the rights individual citizens of these communities had when dealing with individual Romans. All allied states, be they municipia or Latin colonies or Socii, were bound by the same military obligations, though citizens served in the legions and not the ally. The Republic was able to turn other states into their own recruitment administration to mobilise the populace of entire regions to help them conquer more. With their snowballing power, the Romans bested Sabines and Aequi, the Etruscans and then the Samnites in 3 bloody wars, until all of central Italy was theirs, beneath their confederation. The Republic's dominance of central Italy brought it into contact and conflict with the great powers of the rest of the Mediterranean world. Looking at Rome's history, it's really quite striking just how many battles they lost. The reason the Romans won the wars in the end was the sheer, overwhelming manpower their military confederation could raise, and thus, the greatest threats the Republic faced were those which most undermined this foundation of their strength. Proximity brought Rome to blows with the wealthy Hellenic cities of Magna Graecia, especially with Tarentum, the greatest among them. Tarentine envoys were sent to King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great, begging him to defend their liberty from these barbarians. Pyrrhus duly sailed to Italy to take the city for himself. The king was immediately joined by the Samnites, and with his army of war elephants, he trounced the Romans in battle after battle. Yet with each victory, Pyrrhus grew weaker and weaker. He struggled to replace his losses with forcibly conscripted Tarentines. All the while, the Romans kept raising armies from their confederation and growing comparatively stronger until they forced the king to retreat. Pyrrhus was the best commander in that war, and yet he still lost. Taking southern Italy then put Rome directly against the other great empire in the western Mediterranean, Carthage. Allies against Pyrrhus, the two states had been in contact for centuries, but competition over the island of Sicily brought them to war nearly immediately. The Carthaginian tribute empire could simply not put enough mercenaries on the field to compete with what the Romans could mobilise, and so they were ground down over 20 years of warfare until Rome took the Mediterranean islands. Sicily, being their first major conquest beyond Italy, became the first province, governed by an imperial administration the Romans could now afford, but they still always made use of local allies. Carthage had been utterly humiliated, and this was not soon forgotten by Hamilcar Barca. The city's most daring commander, he sought to restore its strength with new conquests in Iberia. After his death, his son Hannibal took up his command. It's said that Hamilcar had made his son swear an oath to never be a friend of Rome. Hannibal would never be a Socius. Attacking a Roman ally in Iberia, he drew Carthage into war, but he did not intend to repeat the last one. Hannibal marched his army and war elephants from Spain over the Alps and fell into Italy like a thunderbolt. In the Po Valley, Hannibal was joined by a sizable force of Gauls. After the First Punic War, the Romans had waged several wars against the peoples there, not to make them allies, but to seize their lands, giving them reason to join the General's Crusade. Then in Italy, Hannibal went on a rampage, tearing apart every army sent up against him, until the Battle of Cannae, where he virtually annihilated a force of 8 legions, 80,000 men, the largest the Romans had ever raised, along with 80 senators and one of the ruling consuls. Every defeat, every crushing loss Hannibal dealt the Republic, tore away the mask of superiority centuries of victory had given Rome. Cannae showed anti-Roman factions that the Republic could be defeated, and that Hannibal would do it. After that fateful battle, the Socii began to rebel en masse. The greatest loss was Capua, the eponymous city of Campania, and the second largest in Italy. And yet, when the dust settled, less than 2/3 of allied states had defected, mostly those in the south. The peoples of central Italy, those who had lived within the Roman system for centuries, those who had built personal ties of guest friendship and even marriage with the Roman elite, those who had fought side by side with the Romans in war and triumph and tragedy, they did not join Hannibal. To them, he was not a liberator, but a foreign general at the head of an army of Gaulic savages who sought to burn their land and that of their Roman brothers down to the ground. It was in this darkest of hours that the strength of the Roman military confederation was most visible. At Cannae, Hannibal's shattered fear of the Romans, that was what made him their greatest enemy. But that meant that the majority of Socii who didn't rebel did not want to end the system. In fact, this was no more true of any city than Capua. The daughter of the city's leader had married a consul, which she could as a Roman citizen. The rebellion of Capua was less a war for independence than a civil war, with the elite of Capua trying to displace those in Rome as leaders of Italy. Perhaps 10% of all male citizens had died in Cannae alone, but with the core of their military confederation intact, the Romans could immediately recruit 12 legions, a number which rose to 22 by the war's end. They used this numerical superiority to distract Hannibal, while reconquering traitors one by one. When Capua was retaken, their state was abolished and their senators were killed or enslaved. Their once great city became nothing but a remote village in the Italian countryside. Such was the price of opposing Rome. Eventually, the general was contained in Bruttium and forced to retreat by an invasion of North Africa. Hannibal was at last defeated in the field at Zama, and the war was ended. Rome's Italian Confederation had brought it victory, and it would continue to do so over the next century of endless war across the entire Mediterranean. But this very success began to undermine the system. Because Roman rule was very light for a foreign conqueror, but the Romans weren't really conquerors, not anymore. And as a union of Italian states, the Roman Confederation was simply unjust. Without the right to vote, the Socii could have their land appropriated for Roman citizens with no option for recourse. So, the Italians began to push to have a say in this system which they had helped build. But the Republic of this time was one of gridlock and public assassinations. The conservatives in the Senate would never tolerate granting these upstart foreigners citizenship. They also worried that whoever supported Italian suffrage now would dominate elections once they had the right to vote. In fact, many Socii masqueraded as Roman citizens because it was so difficult to distinguish them at this point, and the draconian response to this only inflamed tensions. When a citizenship bill failed to pass, the Latin colony of Fregellae attempted to rebel, and was erased for its troubles. The Socii had been shown time and time again that there was no hope in the political process. But the lesson of Fregellae was learned as well, and 30 years afterwards, they would be prepared when they chose to act. States of the Samnites, Lucanians, Campanians, Biscentes, and Marsi, many of which had stayed true after Cannae, raised their armies against Rome. These rebels allied together as Italians. They created a new pan-Italic senate in the Marsic city of Corfinium, renamed Italia, and minted coins showing the Italian bull goring the Roman wolf. These rebels fought to throw off the yoke of Roman tyranny from the peninsula they had unified, and the rebels fought well. Their armies were staffed by veterans of all the same campaigns as the legions. The social war was a real Italian civil war. For the Romans to claim victory, it took 4 brutal years and the promise of full citizenship for the allies who didn't rebel. An offer extended to the rebels as well at war's end. And so, the Italian military confederation, which had thrust Rome to greatness, was ended. Not at the hands of a foreign enemy, but by the desire to become Roman. The savage people of Cisalpine Gaul were eventually given citizenship as well, and their province was abolished so that the entire peninsula was unified as Ager Romanus. People still went to local markets and elected local magistrates to try local cases in their own cities, municipia, exactly as they had done centuries before. But they also felt themselves as part of a much larger community. You could even say a nation. Italy was peripheral no more. It was Rectrix Mundi, governor of the world, and its inhabitants were greater than all other peoples. Because they spoke Latin. Because they were citizens of Rome.